Tonight, something irreversible has taken place in the Persian Gulf. Not an incident, not a warning shot, and not a crisis that can be managed with diplomacy or carefully crafted statements. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz has permanently altered the balance of power in one of the most critical waterways on Earth. In a matter of minutes, a reality that had defined global security for decades collapsed. The assumptions that guided military planning, economic stability, and geopolitical confidence have been shattered. This is not a temporary disruption. This is a turning point. And the consequences are already eating far beyond the battlefield. For decades, the global system has relied on a single assumption: that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open, secure, and protected under Western naval dominance. This narrow passage, carrying a massive portion of the world's oil supply, has been treated as untouchable, a guaranteed artery of global trade. Governments, industries, and entire economies have built their stability on this belief. But that assumption created a dangerous blind spot. Military planners believed that advanced naval fleets, equipped with modern defense systems, could handle any regional threat. Missile defenses, electronic warfare systems, and coordinated fleet formations were designed with the expectation that no regional power could overwhelm them in a decisive way. This belief shaped deployment strategies, risk calculations, and political decisions. At the same time, Western strategic thinking underestimated the possibility that a sanctioned, economically constrained country could develop a highly effective indigenous military capability. Meanwhile, political decisions continued to operate under outdated assumptions. Deployments into high-risk zones were framed as demonstrations of strength and unity, without fully accounting for how vulnerable those forces might actually be in a rapidly evolving threat environment. The result was a dangerous mismatch between perception and reality. What was believed to be a controlled show of force may have, in fact, been exposure to a level of risk that had never been properly tested. Defensive systems designed to counter limited threats were never meant to withstand a highly coordinated, large-scale saturation attack. And when that moment finally came, the gap between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. So what exactly changed? How did a single engagement manage to overturn decades of strategic confidence? What kind of system can overwhelm advanced naval defenses so completely that response becomes nearly impossible in real time? The answer lies not just in the weapon itself, but in how it was used. This was not a random strike or an isolated attack. It was the result of long-term planning, detailed observation, and precise execution. Every movement, every signal, every defensive capability had likely been studied in advance. The engagement wasn't about brute force, it was about timing, coordination, and exploiting weaknesses that had been quietly analyzed for years. And beyond the military dimension, what happens when the world realizes that a critical global choke point is no longer guaranteed to remain open? Energy markets react. Political alliances strain. Strategic calculations shift overnight. What you're about to understand is not just how this event happened, but why it was possible, and what it means for everything that comes next. Everything began long before the first missile ever left its launcher. What unfolded in those critical minutes was not a spontaneous act or a reaction to a sudden trigger. It was the outcome of a process that had been developing quietly, patiently, and with extraordinary discipline. For months, possibly years, patterns were observed, recorded, and analyzed. Movements in the region were not random. They followed routines. Naval deployments, patrol cycles, communication habits, and defensive postures all created a predictable rhythm. And in strategy, predictability is vulnerability. The forces operating in the Strait of Hormuz were positioned in a way that made sense from a traditional perspective. They were there to signal presence, to demonstrate strength, and to reinforce a long-standing assumption. That control of the waterway remained firmly in their hands. But the geography of the strait itself imposed limits that could not be ignored. Narrow waters restrict maneuverability, limited space compresses formations, and proximity to land-based systems introduces a constant layer of exposure. From the outside, it appeared to be a controlled environment. From another perspective, it looked like a perfectly defined target zone. Surveillance played a critical role in shaping what came next. Every radar emission, every communication signal, and every shift in formation contributed to a growing database of operational behavior. Over time, this information was refined into a detailed understanding of how these vessels functioned, not just individually, but as a coordinated group. This level of insight allowed planners to identify a specific window of vulnerability. Timing in this kind of operation is everything. The selected moment was not chosen at random. It aligned with a point in the operational cycle where the distance between vessels reduced their ability to provide mutual defensive support. At the same time, external reinforcement, particularly aerial coverage, was at its lowest availability within that cycle. In simple terms, it was the moment when defensive capacity was stretched the thinnest. Then came the deployment phase. Instead of relying on a single source of attack, multiple launch platforms were used in coordination. Their contribution added complexity, increasing the number of incoming vectors that defenses would have to track simultaneously. A third layer emerged from the maritime environment itself. Fast-moving platforms operating within civilian traffic zones created an additional axis of approach. This blurred the operational picture, making it more difficult to isolate threats quickly and respond effectively. But the real sophistication of the operation was not just in where the missiles came from, it was in how they arrived. This was not a single wave, it was a sequence. The first set of incoming threats served a specific purpose, to force defensive systems into action. Radar systems would activate at full capacity. Interceptor missiles would be launched. Fire control systems would begin processing multiple targets under pressure. In doing so, they would start consuming limited resources, both in terms of physical interceptors and processing capability. While this initial pressure was being handled, the next phase was already underway. Subsequent waves approached from different angles, deliberately chosen to exploit gaps in coverage. Defensive systems are highly capable, but they are not infinite. Each system has limits: how many targets it can track, how quickly it can respond, and how many interceptors it can deploy within a given time frame. By the time these limits were reached, the situation had already shifted. At low-altitude approach levels, incoming threats remain hidden until they cross the radar horizon. This creates an extremely compressed response window. Instead of minutes, defenders may have only seconds to react, and in those seconds, decisions must be made instantly, often under conditions of incomplete information. As multiple threats entered this critical zone, defensive coordination became increasingly difficult. Some systems were already engaged, others were processing incoming data at maximum capacity. Communication between vessels, essential for coordinated defense, was under strain. Each unit was forced to prioritize its own survival, reducing the effectiveness of collective protection. Then came the impacts. Once the first successful strikes occurred, the situation escalated rapidly. Damage to key systems, whether radar, propulsion, or power, can have cascading effects. A vessel that loses its ability to maneuver or defend itself effectively becomes significantly more vulnerable to follow-up strikes. This is where the sequence achieved its full effect. The initial waves had degraded defensive capability. The later waves exploited that degradation, and with each additional impact, the ability to recover diminished further. Inside the vessels, the consequences would have been immediate and severe. Structural damage, system failures, and internal disruptions create an environment where response becomes increasingly difficult. Fire control, damage containment, and emergency procedures all compete for limited time and resources. And time in this scenario was the one thing that was no longer available. Within a very short span, the engagement reached a point where outcome was no longer in question. What had been a coordinated defensive posture turned into a series of isolated struggles. What had been a demonstration of presence became a situation of survival. And what had been assumed to be a secure operational environment revealed itself to be highly contested. When it was over, the transformation was complete, not just in terms of physical damage, but in terms of perception. The event demonstrated that under certain conditions, even advanced systems can be overwhelmed, not because they fail, but because they are forced beyond their design limits. It showed that coordination, timing, and scale can redefine what is possible in modern conflict. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed that the balance between offense and defense is no longer as stable as it once appeared. What happened in those minutes was not just an engagement, it was a shift in how power is applied, how vulnerability is understood, and how future conflicts may be shaped. At the core of this transformation lies a very specific kind of capability, one that does not seek to compete directly with traditional naval power, but instead aims to neutralize it entirely. This capability is built on a simple but highly effective principle. Deny the opponent the ability to operate, rather than trying to defeat them in a conventional confrontation. This shift in approach changes everything. Instead of investing in large fleets or matching advanced warships one-to-one, the focus moves toward precision strike systems that can operate from a distance, remain difficult to detect, and deliver decisive results within a very short time frame. The effectiveness of such systems comes not from a single feature, but from the integration of multiple technological and strategic elements working together seamlessly. The first critical factor is range. By extending the distance from which these systems can engage, launch platforms can operate far beyond the reach of most traditional naval countermeasures. This creates a one-sided engagement environment, where one force can strike without immediately exposing itself to retaliation. It forces opposing fleets to operate under constant threat, even before entering a contested zone. The second factor is guidance and accuracy. Modern strike systems are no longer dependent on a single navigation method. Instead, they combine multiple layers: initial trajectory control, mid-course updates, and terminal guidance. This layered approach allows them to maintain precision even in complex environments, where interference, movement, and countermeasures are all in play. The ability to adjust in real time makes interception significantly more difficult. Then comes the flight profile. Low-altitude approaches, especially in the final phase, dramatically reduce detection range. Radar systems rely on line of sight, and when an incoming object remains close to the surface, it stays hidden until the last possible moment. This compresses the defender's reaction window to mere seconds, far less than what most systems are designed to handle comfortably. Another key element is resistance to countermeasures. Defensive systems often rely on electronic interference, decoys, or signal disruption to mislead incoming threats. However, more advanced seekers are designed to adapt to these tactics. They can shift frequencies, filter noise, and in some cases even use interference itself as a guide. This reduces the effectiveness of traditional defenses and forces a rethink of how protection is structured. But perhaps the most decisive factor is scale. Individually, no system is truly unstoppable. But when deployed in large numbers, the dynamic changes completely. Defensive systems have limits: how many targets they can track, how many interceptors they can deploy, and how quickly they can process incoming threats. The event we've analyzed is not just an isolated demonstration of capability. It is proof of concept for a broader strategic model, one that prioritizes control through denial rather than presence through dominance. This model does not require equal strength. It requires focused development, strategic patience, and a clear understanding of the opponent's weaknesses. And now that it has been demonstrated, it cannot be ignored. Because once a system proves it can redefine the rules of engagement, every future decision, military, political, and economic, must take that reality into account. Now, the real question is not what happened, but what happens next. If access to one of the world's most important waterways can no longer be guaranteed, how do global powers respond? Do they escalate and attempt to reassert control, or do they adapt to a new reality where dominance is no longer absolute? The economic consequences alone are massive. Energy markets depend on stability, and uncertainty drives prices, policy changes, and long-term shifts in infrastructure investment. At the same time, alliances face internal pressure. Different nations have different risk tolerances, economic dependencies, and political constraints. Reaching a unified response becomes increasingly difficult under these conditions. And then there's the broader picture. What does this mean for the future of military power? Are we entering an era where access denial systems define regional control, where smaller or constrained powers can challenge larger forces through focused technological development? Your perspective matters here. Do you think traditional naval power can adapt to this shift? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a new strategic era? Because this isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new phase. What we've just analyzed is only the first visible signal of a deeper transformation. The real impact will unfold over time, through policy decisions, military adjustments, and global reactions that are still developing. The assumptions that shaped decades of strategy have been challenged, but the response to that challenge will define what comes next. Will systems evolve fast enough to counter this kind of threat? Will global powers find new ways to secure critical routes? Or will the balance continue shifting toward those who can deny access rather than control it? One thing is certain. The world that existed before this moment is not the same world that exists now, and the next development is already in motion. Stay aware, because what happens next will matter even more.